the vast field of esoteric healing, it can appear to be bewildering. Many people avoid the subject because they feel inadequate. And even when they try hard, often feel ineffectual. In my own life, I've often been faced with immense studies, investigations, which I have known absolutely nothing. I always find it very useful to employ what knowledge you have, even though it's minimal, and to build up from it, and to establish a tiny area of organization in the field you're investigating, and to branch out from that small point, to establish like a single cell. We're inclined to overlook the fact that the whole human body, made up of trillions of cells, stems from one. One cell becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8, becomes 16, and so on, right up into its mature stage. And today we're going to look at some of the unusual, not rare, very common indeed, unusual facets of esoteric healing. I suppose we could head them under the title of atavism. And by atavism we mean the way in which the past influences the present structure. We mean that some individuals will unaccountably, certainly not through genetic causes, show up with a disease that is peculiar to the family, and hardly ever seen in the environmental region around them, and which hasn't appeared in the family perhaps for 4 or 5 generations. A condition which suddenly manifests again, often in families, but not necessarily so. It's as if some strange feature of the past, which could be psychological, not physical, some psychological feature from the past shows up. And we go along with this proposition of atavism, but we take it further. And we say that features from previous lives surface. Features from previous lives surface. Strange psychological features, some of them even pathological, some of them even sexuopathological. Features from a previous life, from a family, which means that the person need not, rather, the person who had the condition lost in your family need not have been your previous life. Really what we're calling into account is, or taking into account is, the unconscious. Taking into account some features of the unconscious. It's always wise to brood and ponder over a condition that is eluding you in esoteric healing. Strange feature. Sometimes a homosexual spell may emerge unaccountably in a married person, a family, and so on. Sometimes it's much more dangerous and pathological. Sometimes it's just a bizarre trait that emerges. And somebody in the family says, oh, that's just like your grandfather, who's been dead perhaps 80 years or something like of that order. We need to remember that the human entity is never disconnected. Is never disconnected. human entity constantly stands influenced by his very, very ancient history. His very ancient history. Egoic staff all missing again today. Somebody to just, Una, can you just go down and tell them I'm still without black chalk? This is the 4th week. We need to remember that although we are concrete in the physical structure, we are constantly impinged upon by forces which we have once moved around in and still remain latent and able to affect us. We talk about the planes of Atma, from which we stem, and wherein still lies the soul's lotus, the planes of Atma, of Buddhi, and of Manas. And we would say that indeed we are still related to these, and there may equally be surfacings of the spiritual unconscious, and therefore you can get spiritual atavism. Spiritual atavism. We're very happy to acknowledge the existence of diseases which are atavistic, of psychological expressions of behaviour which are atavistic. But we also mean, in the wider sense, that there are qualities of the Egoic Lotus, the soul's lotus, which will surface. And they are ever present, thank heaven. And this is the point of organization of them, the higher self. The higher self. Unfortunately, our link with that higher self is often tenuous and depends to a great extent upon the impacts which lower structures of the various planes are having upon us. Now we enter the fields like the mental plane, the astral, the etheric, and so on. But all the time these planes are functioning, they're operating, and we must never discount them. When we're talking about atavism, we're talking about those deposits of energy which we have left behind. I have said many times that when we vacate a body on the earth, we don't just walk out and leave a vacuum. We leave behind us a nodal point, a nodal region which still emanates or emits radiatory forces that are peculiar to that life long after we have vacated it. We leave behind those radiatory forces. They themselves will gather around perhaps the music that we wrote, so that whenever it is played, it evokes or stimulates consciousness, not only in those who hear the music, but perhaps in a vehicle that you inhabit 3 or 4 lives later. There's no black on it. And so, when we study esoteric healing, the richness of our teachings supplies for us explanations not available to ordinary medicine. Ordinary medicine steers away from subjects like atavistic tendencies because there are no explanations for them. There's no explanation for it. I've had an atavistic tendency in my life, especially in the first 30 years of my life. An atavistic tendency related to 3 lives back. to a life as Paracelsus, a bombastic attitude. Paracelsus was nicknamed Bombastus, or rather I should say he was called Bombastus. And the bombastic attitude is named after Paracelsus. The word derives from Bombastus, and it means that with an excess of confidence, of knowing your material, your subject, your environment, your situation, the attitude becomes harsh and bombastic. And one of the difficulties that this has presented to me in the earlier part of my life was to have this upsurging of bombast occurring under conditions in which I have complete control. Then, in those conditions, it is easy to handle. What is much more difficult has been to handle the bombast when you are in a position of having to be spoken down to, and the upsurge to answer back, the upsurge to retaliate is almost overpowering. Let us take an example, not in my life, but from this kind of situation, in which perhaps a high-ranking person, a prelate or a pope, was talking to a group and saying things which antagonize the group, or at least one or two in the group. Now, normally, when a high-ranking individual who is greatly respected and known to be true and valid and honest says something which offends you, you have the courtesy to be quiet and to listen. But in such circumstances, it would make no difference whatever to this individual who the rank or what the rank of the individual was. He would criticize openly, on the spot, immediately, whatever offended. And so there are atavistic tendencies in almost every personality. And when they are merely personality factors, we take little concern for them. However, when they become the source of disease or the cause of definite pathological expressions, then we are very concerned with them. You see, at least it's useful to know where they come from. Always imagine or remember that man's consciousness is like a screen, and that we very frequently place on the screen elements which are associated with the externa, expressions from our own lives. But when the expressions on the screen of consciousness, taken from our circumstances, our environment, and our peers, are very similar to the circumstances of the previous life, then by atavistic expression, some qualities of the previous life will enter onto the same screen and take their part there and play their part there. So you only have to act out a scene in this life which may have all the characteristics of today's fashions and today's structures, externa as we call them. But if it is very similar to scenes that have existed in a previous life, then the atavistic tendency becomes overpowering, and there rushes through from the depths of your unconscious an attempt once more to express qualities similar to those circumstances from a previous life. Surprising what part atavism plays, both in in ordinary individuals, especially in savages, who are guided considerably by the atavistic expressions of their tribe. The whole tribe virtually speaks as one entity. But when we begin to tread the path, atavism is often an expression of what Madame Blavatsky referred to when she said, "The moment you begin to tread the path of unfoldment, everything that is good in you and everything that is difficult in you will be thrown to the surface sooner or later." And it is through the atavistic mechanisms that indeed such things are thrown to the surface in many of us. By atavism, we talk about a reversion in some peculiarity to a more remote ancestor, And that is as far as it is accepted in psychological terms. Not the idea of reincarnation at all, but that you are suddenly expressing a characteristic of one of your ancestors. And the characteristic is often so peculiar and existential that there's no doubt about it. And this carries us into the field of sexuality. And it is in the field of sexuality that existentialism features so prominently, that a person may have sexual expressions which are bizarre, which are extremely unusual, unique even. We accept this in the animal kingdom, where instinct plays a great part, where the atavism of the species speaks through the animals and dictates their extraordinary sexual behavior, which includes what we call display. And so animal types will display in the weirdest, in the most extraordinary, and apparently irrelevant and unrelated ways, with a richness of color supported by feathers and beaks and claws and habits and other expressions which make these bizarre. Well, we have enough of that in us. And indeed, the atavism may express itself strongly in what we call, for instance, fetishism, where the person has a fetish. And before we regard ourselves as sacrosanct from such a field of expression, let's just examine fetishism with one or two examples, where the young man develops a fetish for high-heeled shoes, and from the fetish may have a development further which makes him desire to be trodden on by high-heeled shoes, so that even straightforward sexual experience does not lead him on to orgasm, but just being trodden on by high-heeled shoes is sufficient to develop that. Now that is a very existential, peculiar, rare, unusual feature. Not as unusual as we may think. Probably thousands of cases have been written up on that single fetish. But when you examine ordinary men, and by ordinary we mean socially accepted male attitudes, we find that these socially accepted male attitudes would extend to a predilection towards the breasts, the female breasts, an inordinate attraction to that feature of the female and nothing else, or other contours of the female. And indeed, for some men it's the legs, for some men it's the breasts, for some men it's the eyes or whatever it is. So the apparent abnormality and extreme peculiarity of a fetish is only one of relativeness. And given a condition in this life in which the upbringing, in which the circumstances are again reminiscent of a previous life's circumstances, in which such a fetish existed, or such a trait existed, then onto this screen of circumstances there is projected suddenly, by atavistic mechanisms, that set of circumstances and forces which will produce a fetish behavior. Of course, the world is concerned mainly with the recurrence of diseases after the lapse of some generations, and this is where the atavism is mainly concerned, or of main importance. But we don't overlook its effects, and we link them to previous lives. We would give very much more concern to an atavistic tendency, because, as we know, in the last run around the zodiac, the last series of lives that we express, the last 20 to 40 lives on Earth, are ones in which we tidy up. We tidy up the various frayed ends of our nature. And I haven't even mentioned the permanent atoms that we carry over from life to life. I haven't even mentioned them here, and they would, of course, play a part in atavism. And so we're concerned always in ourselves with atavistic tendencies. And you see, atavism invites our discrimination very strongly. We need to discriminate the real from the unreal. And many atavistic qualities are spiritual, as I have indicated, from the possibility of their sources lying in the field of the lotus, of the higher self, the realms of Atma, Buddhi and Manas. And when we understand that the soul is neutral sexually, the soul is neutral sexually, we must examine very carefully atavistic qualities which are sexual, or, in fact, asexual. Because a person can stand out in sexual realms or in sexual fields by being asexual. By being asexual, they may be described as cold or frigid, but it may be an atavism, which is of a high spiritual standing. Very rarely so, but it might be so. So we are ever asking ourselves, what is the esoteric significance? Is it a kind of nostalgia? Is it a nostalgia that extends not back to the early part of our lives, but over several lives? A yearning for? And what about the changes of sexes from life to life? Is it always one in which we undergo a series of expressions, so that we would have a series of female lives, one after the other, becoming more and more female, and then less and less female, and moving towards the neutral state? And then after that, another series of lives in which you are becoming more and more male, life after life. See, the matter is not easy. And the atavism may extend back several lives. so that the circumstances of one life, which now try to express themselves in similar circumstances in this life, may come from a life that was of the opposite sex, though the circumstances are similar. And it is absolutely unforgivable for anybody acting under the name of esoteric healing to sit in moral judgment on the kinds of patients, or the qualities of the patients that approach them. You may say to yourself, yes, well, I only judge or sit in judgment on certain things. I don't mind this and I don't mind that and I don't mind a little of that. But I very much reject this or reject that. Who the hell are you to decide? When you hadn't even heard of atavism 24 hours ago. And so when you have young people come to you with drug problems, with sexual problems, with problems of repeated habits, it is quite unwise for you to judge them by the moral standards of the day or by the moral standards of this life, when the pressure of earlier lives is strong upon them and being made stronger all the time by the fact that they are struggling towards esoteric expression, towards spiritual expression, which brings down the atavism, as Madame Blavatsky suggested. And so when we talk about treading the path and discriminating the real from the unreal, we perhaps have overlooked the fact that we are not concerned merely with this blink of an eyelid, which we call the present life. But we're concerned with many lives, and rightly so. Do you think that you can think as a mortal human being in this life and suddenly change to become a master with all the views and concepts and principles of immortality? And you can do this overnight? Don't kid yourself. You can't. You have to spend immense periods of time to allow these powers pertaining to the soul to take a grasp of you. Why, even nature gives consideration to this fact. No child becomes adult overnight. Imagine the disastrous circumstances of a boy of 14 entering puberty, suddenly becoming an adult male overnight, and having to contend with the thrusts and the emerging pressures and powers of an adult, sexually, psychologically, and in every other way, overnight. Even when it takes the youngster 5 or 6 years to go through this delicate transition of growth, it is difficult, very difficult indeed. And I refer to this critical period of change because we ourselves go through a puberty of spiritual unfoldment. We ourselves go through the puberty of spiritual unfoldment. We're all youngsters, embryos, no matter how old our souls are. We are at an embryonic stage in the present life and have to go through the period of pubescence, who is not related in some way to atavistic tendencies. Some of them spiritual and some of them non-spiritual. Let us give an example of atavism on a fairly large scale so that it becomes embodied into the culture of a society that you would have thought would have known better. a society no less eminent and prestigious as that of Rome itself, with whom most of us have connections, and I more than my fair share. There was a practice in ancient Rome, and even in fairly modern Rome. There was a practice known as augury, A-U-G-U-R-Y, augury. And by augury, the extraordinary practice was entered into, by which the entrails of an animal were examined in order to decide the propitiousness of a specific moment in time, and other features as well, not just the entrails, the way in which the entrails lay, and the plunging of the hand into the warm body of the animal, and all sorts of signs and symptoms given off which were meant to portray whether the time was suitable or not for some great function. Pure atavism. The reversion to practices going back thousands and thousands of years, expressed at a national scale in a cultural practice of the time of Rome. Yet you will know, if you have studied Havelock Ellis's books on psychology of sex, or Prof. Ebbing, or many of the other so-called authorities, whose authoritarianism pales into insignificance when you study the statistical material of the Kinsey report. When you study their works, you find that there are certain sexual fetishes now being displayed rather prominently and dramatically in the Yorkshire Ripper, in which the behaviour of the individual requires mutilation and often the plunging of the hand into the warm entrails of the victim without any malice involved at all. It is part of an atavistic tendency, which is paralleled and accompanied by orgasm at that moment. Now, it is the way of esoteric people, and I can talk harshly to you because I'm one of you, that we tend to latch on to the extenuated and the exaggerated features of what we talk about. I can give a lecture on something perfectly straightforward, and at the end of the lecture I'm asked the most extraordinary, outlandish questions, not about the normal features of the lecture, but the abnormal features of it. Why can't I visualize properly when I've only got one eye? As I always characteristically say, let's keep question time away from yetis and away from werewolves. There are so many important things that pertain to us closely and an average life and existence. And so think again. And esoteric healers are so inclined to feel that it's pat. Just pat. All you need to do is put your hands on and think of God. I wish that it were true. In fact, such acts in which you believe that God will do everything, that all you have to do is to lay your hands on, that these very often act as a smoke screen for the healer. They think they're doing well and the patient pities them and goes off just as virulent in his condition as before. It is through understanding that, or having knowledge of ourselves that we grow. Man, know thyself. And know thyself does not mean know what the Christian concept of God is. It's not knowing yourself. Knowing what the Christians think of God, or knowing what the Hindus think of God, or what the Muslims think of God, or what the Buddhists think of God. Which one will you take? And which will be the panacea? Man, as we considered last week, is the grand symbol of the universe. In him there is symbolized all things. And if you do not know man, I do not mean that you must have, for instance, a thorough study of anatomy, but if you do not know man, and especially the interacting relationships of man, which produce the beauty of his behavior and the richness of his behavior, you do not know man and man's works, then you will never really make a healer of any dimension or proportion. Healing does not mean that you grab hold of a person, sit him down in a chair in a healing sanctuary, lay your hands on him, and that's that. Would that it were, but it's not. It is a process in which you shoulder responsibility for the patient, maybe for years, until the patient can shoulder his own responsibilities once more. And when you shoulder responsibilities for him, you are shouldering energies which you pass on to him from his own soul, because there's a blockage. The soul can't reach him, and so passes energy through you to him, passes meaning from you to him, because he is blocked to meaning. He has been blocked by a religious upbringing. He's been blocked by a harsh treatment by a cruel father. He's been blocked by this or by that. And you as the healer must transmit from his soul to him, bypass through you the energies that cannot now reach him because of his blockages, his inhibitions of energy and meaning. It is probably this aspect of healing that attracts more ridicule from the world, and generally justifiably, than anything else. That healing is a pat process. I've been into this matter very carefully of atavism. Search by various methods. There is no evidence at all in a person's bodily cells of any agent that acts for atavistic tendencies. Many other occult features are related to it, but the actual cells of your body do not play a part in it. Why should he make a statement like that? Well, first of all, it disposes of any idea that we may have that atavism can be a genetic throwback. And secondly, it tells us that the cure, the treatment, if not the cure, that the treatment of the condition need not be through physical methods, but rather through subtler methods. We need to use subtler devices. And we in esoteric healing have very fine advantages to deal with this. The way of medical science would be to put the person who has a sadistic tendency, there it is again, sadism coming out. See how it relates up to many things that you're bound to be confronted with. The normal, natural, sadistic tendencies of children who are very cruel individuals. I can remember throwing hairy caterpillars into a tin on a fire and watching them jump, as if it was yesterday. And we express cruelty as children, naturally, because the childhood state of man reflects the childhood state of mankind. And in the childhood state of mankind, great cruelties were perpetrated. Sometimes these cruel tendencies remain, fed by atavism, and a series of cruel lives may maintain the cruelty of childhood into adult stages. Ideally, of course, we would like, as esoteric healers, to reach this condition as deeply as possible. So I'm going to discuss, or I'm going to suggest 4 flower remedies, which could be used where it seems apparent that atavistic tendencies are at play. Perhaps the persistence of a cruel streak, perhaps the persistence of or emergence of something sexual. And do remember that many of these things only surface when the person is under stress, when the person is placed under extreme stress. Who was it now? Luther Burbank showed quite clearly that under stress, plants were more receptive. We have learnt again and again here in esoteric fields that place the disciple under stress, and he's more receptive. Shut him off, place him under stress, and he's as receptive as can be. And that was often in the techniques of the Catholic Church, where the individual was penned off from the world, so he had no other court of appeal outside of his own self, and at the same time stress imposed upon him. For that you will do penance, you will do this, you will do that, you will do so and so. So the stress is increased, the person is isolated and alienated, and he is ready for brainwashing. We say that this is preferably brainwashing from the higher self, receptivity to the higher self. All sorts of interesting features emerge. But I want you to remember one thing every time you consider what might be an atavistic tendency or fragment of behavior. I want you to test it with one important feature. Atavistic tendencies are never overt. They're never overt. By that we mean they are never deliberate, displayed, shown off, calculated, deliberate. We don't mean that at all. We mean that they must be covert, veiled, hidden, instinctual, unplanned, uncalculated, emergent. Those are the sort of words to think of. The moment that the behavioral pattern seems to be connived, set up, you can rule out the atavism. Set up it might be, but with an inexorability that is driven from within, a compulsion, much, much more plutonic and chthonic, emerging from depths, than anything leonine, showing off. So that is a test of it. Is it covert? Sometimes atavism can suddenly emerge in a group where it wouldn't emerge in an individual. It will emerge in a group where it wouldn't emerge in an individual, but it must still be covert. Men in contact together as a group will often act very differently from an individual man, as we all know. You get a couple of shy men who wouldn't say boo to their girlfriend neighbors, put them on the back of a lorry with 10 other men, and they're shrieking and whistling at every girl that they see on the sidewalk. That's how men act together. There is an element there of atavism, but it shouldn't be overrated. I think perhaps in that respect the world records must go to the Australian troops during the First and Second World War, who never ever got together on a foreign piece of land without some enormously planned piece of mischief. I remember in Durban during the last World War how they took over all the rickshaws, which are carriages usually drawn by very ornate, painted Zulu boys. Well, they took them all over and held races down the main street with these rickshaws. Of course, there are far worse things than that. One suspects group atavism there, but it's rare. Where it is overt, it is unlikely. But if a group gets together, and by virtue of great stress, rather than out of necessity, practice cannibalism, by virtue of circumstances rather than by deliberate planning, then you can suspect group atavism. And we base many of our esoteric processes on group atavism of the highest order, where it's easier to do a thing in a group. And then whilst you are doing certain things which should be laid down ritualistically, other things come through. And we know that in the age ahead of us, which is ruled by Jupiter, the age of Aquarius, that this age is concerned with group activity, and group activities of such an order that we can't even dimly assess their possibilities and potential. Group formation, group activity, group response, group initiative, groups providing opportunities for individuals who on their own could never have a hope of initiation, but with the group can take a group initiation. And so we are expecting in the new age immense spiritual atavism to function through groups. And even if we don't get the results that we pine for in group healing, esoteric healing in groups, it is so important for us to lay down, to begin to lay down, to create precedents for group interrelationships activities, cohesiveness, that this alone in itself is very valuable indeed, even if we don't succeed so much in our healing. It is to prepare the framework for what is going to come in the next 2,000 years. You'll all be back again and again in those 2,000 years, helping with the integration of groups who are to carry unusual energies, almost bizarre energies. They're bizarre to the stuffiness of current social attitudes. The Claregate method itself is bizarre, but it will come into its own as groups learn to work with each other. Of course, we must consider here today that atavism is related to the dweller on the threshold. That for some individuals, the dweller represents the only coherent screen that exists. Would that it were so that people had screens to their consciousness which were absolutely clear, so that any image thrown onto them was not distorted. But it's rare. And in group unfoldment and in meditation, we learn to clear the screen so that distortion is minimal, so that the real can be discriminated from the unreal. And so, when you consider something of the order of fetishes, of gross distortions of behaviour that are atavistic, you must almost certainly consider the probability that there is a dweller of great potency in the patient that you are trying to reach. A dweller. A receiving plate. That which is susceptible to atavistic surfacing, the dweller. And whereas a calm, stable individual would have a consciousness that is clear, in the case of emotionally disoriented individuals, individuals who are even psychotic, and we'll describe psychosis in a moment, you must suspect a dweller. And the atavism distorts the dweller, creates images in the dweller, which then impinge upon the individual's consciousness, which may drive him to certain acts and tendencies, may be at the basis of nightmares, and so on. I asked the Namanikaya how atavism expresses itself in people on the path. And he said that the moment a spiritual individual or an individual capable of spiritual growth halts in his development, it is then that atavism is the first debt that they must pay for this halting. I know that some of us think that we can make a good effort for a month and then we can rest for 6 months. Put another spurt in spiritually and then cruise for a few years after that. It doesn't work like that. Spiritual growth is a continuous process. If we express the soul, we express a continuous process of spiritual growth. If you are a person who still functions by stops and starts, by spurts, the path is really not for you yet. The way in which the soul expresses its disagreement with your shortfall in spiritual progress is by atavistic experience. So let me just say it as I received it. Those who halt in spiritual development manifest atavism as the first debt they pay. Manifest atavism as the first debt they pay. How does this show in normal circumstances and the kind of patients that you're likely to be presented with? A mother brings a child along and the child has an extraordinary pre-aptitude for something. Where has he got it from? Where has he got this from? I know it's hard. I'm not like that. In my family. He has an extraordinary pre-aptitude for something. Sadism, fetishism, whatever it is. That is an indication, usually, of atavism. Where he hasn't learnt it, it hasn't been taught to him, he's not been initiated into it at school, but suddenly produces it. And I can think of a dozen conditions there. Where there is sexual precociousness, which cannot be explained by any overtness, where there isn't, for instance, an extremely hot climate where children come on around the age of about 11, whereas in this country it's about the age of 14. Where there is sexual precociousness without that climatic factor, where there is sexual precociousness without some organic fault, where the organs are excessively developed or the person has been subjected to a precocious sexual experience like incest or something like that, where it is inexplicable, covert. A way in which you can detect atavism in spiritual people. It's the reason why I always put this question when I can remember to, right at the beginning of a spiritual interview. How did you come to be interested in the esoteric? Was it because you lost a mother early in life and you were obsessed with the idea that there must be survival after death or something like that? In other words, a tragedy? Or did you just gravitate towards it progressively? Where they have gravitated towards it progressively without any specific event in their life, you can suspect atavism. Atavism of the spiritual nature. A series of lives, you can be absolutely certain, obviously. A series of lives in which they've trod the path. And this life is inevitably, again, treading the path. And the mechanism is spiritual atavism.